History isn't dry, it isn't dusty. It can be dynamic, thought-provoking, political, and it can still have the power to impact on our lives even today in this age of modern technology and fast lives and fast cars. But to make it live and for it to be properly explored, it has to be questioned, it has to be analysed, it has to be challenged. Now, we're particularly lucky here in Maldon, in a place that's so rich in history. It has a rich past just there for us to explore, just there for the picking if we take time to look into it. What do you think about when Maldon is mentioned? Do you think about barges? Do you think about the Moot Hall, All Saints and its triangular tower, Edward Bright, the Fat Man, or even Maldon Salt perhaps? But above all of those things, surely people would mention 991, the year 991, the year of the Battle of Maldon, world famous, but surely the most important event in our town's history. But when one mentions the battle, it conjures up a picture of bravery against all of the odds, of Viking marauders, of Brythnoth or Berthnoth, and of course that famous poem. And this place, the causeway to Northey Island. It's really stirring stuff, but for me, there are problems with it. It was, of course, a long time ago, but has the legend of the Battle of Maldon become the fact? I want to briefly explore that with you. Like many Maldonians, I was brought up on stories of this, the town's most important historic event, the Battle of Maldon of 991, when I was at school. The tale that was drummed into me and my contemporaries at Maldon All Saints Primary School was about the unquestionable bravery of our early founding father, Brythnoth. His statue would stare down at us as we processed to All Saints Church for services and for Sunday school. That 1907 Nathaniel Hitch carved sandstone image seemed to my young eyes to epitomise the story. Here we have a strong, elderly looking man with a square cut jaw, a mighty sword, a helmet and a shield, staring down across the high street, just daring any enemy to come within sight of his beloved town. And to reinforce all of that, we had the poem. The poem was read out to us during lessons. It's a testament to strength of character, in doing the right thing, somehow being very British, somehow almost being cricket-like, in allowing fairness and balance despite overwhelming odds. And then there was the battle site itself. No one was in any doubt whatsoever. So it took place off of Mundham Road on the mainland opposite Northey Island, the Viking army being allowed to cross the tidal causeway by our brave eldermen. There's no doubt that it's all very inspiring stuff and it instills pride in one's national heritage and hometown. But as I've said, there's something wrong. To my mind, even the topography didn't make sense. Why would a hitherto unchallenged invasion fleet, we are told consisting of 93 longships, that could be an army of what, 2,000 to 4,000 men, why would they land on a remote island a considerable distance from the ancient core of Maldon, of the town? And why would the invaders purposely cut themselves off in this way, creating such a logistical nightmare for themselves? They had, after all, been offered no resistance at all during their raids on Ipswich and Sandwich, and did they expect any at Maldon? They'd sailed the complete length of the River Blackwater, and their arrival must have received some kind of local alert from the moment they passed the settlement of Yfanchester, today's Bradwell-on-Sea. And talking of the river, hadn't the river itself changed course since the 10th century? Wasn't the main channel into Maldon along the small ditch that we now know of as Heybridge Creek? Hadn't Northey itself changed shape and size? And weren't there other islands in the river, not least Osey opposite the Barrow Hills, which for many years were thought to be the burial mounds of the dead from the battle, and the now long gone Ramsay Island near Stansgate. Why Northey? And wasn't the heart of Maldon and its wealth in the form of an operational mint originally situated in the Burr Fortress, which was in the London Road area of Maldon, rather than down in the riverside parish of St Mary? I soon discovered that I wasn't the first person to think about this and think in this way, and think about the original topography of the battle. In fact, one of my heroes, the former mayor and local historian Edward Arthur Fitch, who knew Maldon like the back of his hand, had the battle taking place not here at Northey Island, but in a completely different location. And he mentions Heybridge Church, and he did so in his important work, Maldon and the River Blackwater, first published back in 1895. But he wasn't the only one. The nationally renowned Professor E. Freeman, in his major study on the Norman Conquest, also looks back at the Saxon period and locates the battle in the same place as Fitch. In fact, I discovered that it wasn't until as late as the mid-1920s that anyone had even suggested Northey Island as a feature of the Battle of Maldon. But the idea was born in the mind of somebody with a PhD. So surely it's right. Well, I don't think it is. And it's been my lifelong mission ever since to search out the truth, or more importantly, to at least challenge what's now sadly become the accepted, rather blinkered story. I joined a team of other archaeologists in a field walking survey of the Northey Island mainland area in the 1980s to see if we could find any evidence of the battle. We found Roman, we found medieval, we found post-medieval material, but no Saxon material, and certainly no evidence of a massive Dark Age battle. There was even an exercise in the 1970s by an American couple who decided that the geology of Northey actually probably wasn't right. The results were far from conclusive in terms of Northey. There are other archaeologists that have also wondered whether Northey really fits the bill. So what do I think is the truth here? Unfortunately, tradition, legend, primary and secondary source material have all blended into one pot of total confusion. Sadly, without the discovery of new archaeological or documentary evidence, we're going to struggle to completely unpick things. But is it really unlikely? Is it unlikely that there won't be any more archaeological evidence? Let's see. But even the limited material that is available consists of many contradictions. Take the date, for example, 991. Of the 7 separate chronicles that make up the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, 2 dates are given, 991 and 993. The life of Oswald even dates the battle to 988. Church annals say that the battle took place on the 10th of August. A Winchester source says the 11th. But the basic sequence of events seem to reoccur throughout. Anlaf, actually Olav Tryggvason, later King of Norway from 995 to the year 1000, came with a force of 93 ships. He landed on a piece of land that was cut off from the mainland by a tide. When his troops tried to cross a causeway, they were cut down by Brythnoth and his defenders. Olaf asked to fight a fair battle. Brythnoth allowed them to cross over to the mainland, and Brythnoth and the local retainers were defeated. That's essentially the story, although there's lots of imagery in there about bravery and about why it happened that way. We know that the Vikings had attacked and destroyed Ipswich and Sandwich and met with no resistance in either of those places. On they came to Maldon, where battle ensued with Brythnoth. He was an old man in his day, described in the life of Oswald as tall, grey-haired and ageing, but in reality he was probably about 65. Archaeological evidence, albeit of a 1769 vintage, adds credence to the suggestion that the invaders decapitated Brythnoth's skull, for when his tomb was opened in the 18th century, the skull was missing. This is the niche here at Ely Cathedral, where the remains are now held. £10,000 worth of Danegeld, the first payment of extortion money, was actually included in the payment to the Vikings to make them go away. £10,000. Nowadays, that's reckoned to be about 48 million. That's in today's money. Maldon had a mint from 916 until the early 12th century, and these are some examples of Maldon minted pennies. And they still turn up from time to time in Denmark and Norway and Sweden. But how did the battle actually unfold? We turn to one of the most important pieces of Anglo-Saxon literature, second only in importance perhaps to Beowulf, the poem of the same name, The Battle of Maldon. The trouble is, we're frustrated again here because we can't study the original document. It was destroyed in a fire in 1731. So we have to rely on a transcript of what is, after all, a fragment of the original poem. It's an exceptional work, but is it accurate? It's certainly very heroic, but then it would be, wouldn't it? Because it was commissioned by Brythnoth's widow, along with a now lost tapestry. And it's full of imagery, the same imagery that you will find in the quite separate and unrelated words of Beowulf. So you decide, were the raiders unexpected? Did Brythnoth allow a fair battle, resulting in such devastating consequences? The poem does, however, contain some very specific clues as to the geography of the battle that might just be an objective and contemporary report. There's mention of some directional compass points, the Vikings passing west, for example. Reference is made to the delay caused by the tide. There's mention of a causeway, and more controversially, a brick, a bridge or a ford, and a nearby wood. Enter stage left, Dr. Edward Dalrymple Laborde, and this paper, this 13-page paper and one map in the English Historical Review, which was published in 1925, confirming Northey as the site. The Northey legend was born and sadly continues to breathe. But why, in the words of A.H. Burn in his Battlefields of England, would the Danes allow themselves to be cooped up on an island, cut off from the shore at an undoubted strategic disadvantage and a considerable distance from the town? Perhaps they didn't, and perhaps the clues can take us elsewhere. Fitch believed that the battle took place, in his words, where Heybridge Church now stands. Consider that idea. Difficult for us to believe today, but Heybridge Creek would have been navigable all the way up to the site of the church, to the settlement established by the Romans and under the control of Tid Waldington, Tidstown, a lordship endowed under King Athelstan. The course of the river at that point is the western town limit. Is that the west of the poem? The river course continued in use for many centuries later, linked to the economy of Heybridge and its mill, and it would regularly flood on the tide. And the route from Heybridge to Maldon, up on its hill, Melduna, the hill of assembly, or the hill marked by a cross, was by way of a track across the marsh. That track regularly flooded on the tide. Morant said in the 18th century that the church lies on the strand, a beach, and the tide comes up to the churchyard. And what's the name of that track between Heybridge and Maldon? To this day, it's still called the Causeway, the exact term used in the poem. At the top of the causeway Maldon's Hill is naturally defended by the sweep of the river and follows over a strategic crossing point that from many centuries has been known as Full Bridge, literally muddy bridge. Is this the bridge of the poem? There was certainly a bridge there in the 12th century, and so important that it came under the responsibility of the Knights Templar. To the right of the bridge and alongside the river course was substantial woodland, so great that it gave the place its name, a Saxon name, Beely, a clearing in the trees where beehives are kept. Having negotiated the causeway and fought across the bridge, next were the defences of the hill. At the top of the hill was the fortified town, the Burh, constructed by Edward the Elder in 916, and a lucrative mint producing coinage from the early 10th to the late 11th centuries. The lines of that Burh could still be drawn by Strutt in 1775 and centred on London and Beely roads, overlooking the river and the causeway. Wouldn't it make much more sense that an enemy that had hitherto experienced no challenge would sail as near to the settlement as possible to prepare to storm the fort from a safe position on the opposite side of the river below it, only to be initially thwarted by the natural element of the tide? In the poem, Brythnoth says that the invaders had penetrated far into our territory. They stood on either side of the riverbank, divided by the flood, and his men defended the bridge. We all know that the invaders eventually climbed the ramparts of the by now sparsely defended fort to the rich pickings of the mint town. But when it was all over, and in commemoration of what had happened, was the church of St Andrew Heybridge constructed, just like that at nearby Ashington, built to commemorate the later Battle of Ashington? By a very strange coincidence, both churches are dedicated to St Andrew, the apostle and Christian martyr. The present-day church building was founded in the 12th century, but a Saxon predecessor has always been assumed to have been on the site. And what about the archaeological evidence? Well, I said in the unlikely event of the discovery of more evidence, but then a certain sword was discovered. This sword has been confirmed by experts to be 10th century Viking, and it wasn't discovered anywhere near Northey Island. It was discovered in Heybridge. So this story about Northey Island makes no sense to me whatsoever. The evidence, I believe, takes us elsewhere. But my theory is all that it is. It's a theory. It's never been my intention to be as equally dogmatic about Heybridge as others have about Northey. Rather, I think we should question history, not blindly accept the official location. If we do, then the legend, albeit originating in 1925, some 934 years after the battle, becomes the fact.